All right, so I'm going to give you these next notes as we move forward in biology. We've talked about living things. We've talked about the basic characteristics of living things, and we went to the main idea of the cell, right? So one of our big things we've been talking about is the cell and all the things that are connected to the cell. And then we talked about organelles, and one big organelle that we've kind of mentioned, but has not really been gone into too much detail, is the cell membrane. And that's just the part of the cell, like if I was going to draw a cell, just usually people think of round cells, right? Then they have the nucleus in the middle, and they have this little part around here. Let's just make this bigger. This little part around the outside, that's the cell membrane. Okay. The cell membrane, in this little picture, it's hard to see. Let me see if I can draw a membrane here. It's tough to draw with this. Okay, it's made up of, it's a phospholipid bilayer. It's like two phospholipids. So this thing here is a phospholipid, that's a phospholipid, and they're facing away from each other. That's because this head has a positive charge to it, and this has a positive charge to it, and we're trying to get away from each other, but they're all held in place like this. Okay. And this does have a charge, and they're kind of tightly together, so these will stay here, even though they have the same charge. But because they have this, they're polar and they have positive on one end and negative on the other, they form this nice layer all the way around the cell, these things facing away from each other. And that forms a cell membrane, and that helps keep some things out. They can't get in because of this charge, because they're tightly packed together. But still the cell needs to get things into the cell. Like there's certain things like nutrients. The cell produces energy through mitochondria, so materials have to get in for that. And also waste in the cell, and when the cell makes proteins, those things have to get out. Okay, so the cell membrane has to have a way to allow that, right? And if you remember, we call the cell membrane the gatekeeper. It's like a gate, protects the cell, keeps some things out, but then has a way for those things that need to get in to get in. Okay, so if you talk about movement in the cell, you either have diffusion or you have transport. Okay, and I'm going to erase some of this stuff now. Oh, do that. Try that again. I want that thing. Delete. Might have to go slower here. Pull some of these over. Let's try this now. Delete. Pull this thing maybe. Yeah, let's do it again. Just move this over for a minute. Should be easier than this, I'd say. Let me just get rid of some of it. Okay. So we got diffusion and transport. Okay, diffusion is something everybody pretty much understands, and it's just movement of particles from high to low. It always goes that way. So high to low. And I've kind of given you a little bit of a primer on this in the last video. Let's get this here. Okay, so here we're going to have O2 on this side, O2, O2. If this was the outside of a cell, we had like all these little O2s out here. And on the inside of the cell, there was 1. Okay, and you have 1, 2, 3, 5 over here. So then this O2 is going to come in. This O2 is going to come in. It's going to give it 3. And this one might not realize it, and it come in as well. Then we're going to have another one go out. But in the end, they're going to go back and forth until they're all the same, and they've reached something called equilibrium. And this first type of diffusion or transport is called passive transport, and it just goes from high to low. It's talking about gases and other things that the cell needs, and they just are able to get in through this phospholipid bilayer. So that's passive, no energy required, and it's just a natural process that occurs in the cell. Get rid of some of these now. Back to where we were. Okay. Put this back. So this is the inside of the cell. This is the outside. Many times we have another cell here. They're next to each other. This cell has a whole bunch of oxygen. This one doesn't. You can kind of think of the circulatory system like something that has a whole bunch of oxygen, like the lungs. The veins that are going by don't have it very much. Maybe they have a bunch of CO2 and they exchange that way. Okay, but that's passive transport. Now we're going to go down to the next layer here. That's passive transport. Okay. And then if we're talking about the next type, it's facilitated diffusion or facilitated transport. Again, it's still moving from high to low, does not require energy, but it uses protein channels. So let me go back here. Maybe I'll just draw you a picture here. So you have this phospholipid bilayer, right? Like here and here. Put like a few of them. This thing here. This is the lipid from the macromolecule that makes this thing up, and so on. Okay, then they have a channel right in here. It's made of a protein, and this is surrounded by this phospholipid bilayer. Hopefully you can understand this. Sometimes the pictures are hard to make on this program. Okay, so you might have something that needs to get across here, and we'll just make it like a big triangle thing, right? And it needs to get through here. It's not able to get through these little bilayer here, and just too big. So this little thing may have a shape to it. It may look like this, for the triangle that substance to fit in there, right? When it gets near to it, it's able to okay. So this thing will fit down inside here. When it kind of touches it, it then fits inside this here. This thing will close together, it'll like change its shape, and then it goes onto the inside. So that's a protein channel. They have like channels that are made for very specific substances. Doesn't require any energy, and often it's large molecules like glucose and such that can't get through because they're just too big, or something that has a charge, because you remember this is positively charged on this side. There's nothing on the inside, or negatively charged. I'm sorry, it is charged, negatively charged here. And sometimes if this thing's charged, it's not going to make it through. It's going to keep being repelled. But that's facilitated diffusion, and it requires a protein channel. We'll talk more about this in class. Okay, so the last one is active transport. This one's much more complex. I'm not going to deal with it too much here, just a little bit. So active transport, it's moving from low to high. This requires energy. What it uses is something called ATP, or adenine triphosphate. So if the cell wants to move this thing across the membrane, it's going to require energy. It's going to use something called a protein pump, and there's calcium pumps, there's potassium pumps, and sodium pumps. Potassium sodium pump, I think, is the one really common one. I'll just show you a picture of one. Actually, maybe I'm not, but I'll show you one in class. But they're very specific. They have these little steps that they go through. If we were going to look at, I don't know if I want to redraw it here, but maybe I'll give it a quick try here. So I have these things here, this thing here, then you have like a little protein here, but it's really not a channel. Then you might have another little thing down here, maybe this thing here. These are like little proteins that get added in here, and they kind of get melded in between these things, this phospholipid bilayer. And what happens is, a lot of times it does this, sends an electron down through these. It's not as important as um, to know all these little particulars about it. We'll probably look at it when we do cellular respiration in more detail. But what's really happening here is there's like this little, it's called a ETC, or an ETC, electron transport chain. And it transfers this electron down through, like it starts here and just moves down through here. When it does that, it does some chemical reactions that allows another substance, like this will open, eventually form an opening, and then the substance will come through. We're going to look at these in much more detail. They're pretty complex, okay? But they help with things like cellular respiration, photosynthesis. They help the cell do that, but it does require energy. And like in photosynthesis or cellular respiration, it creates more than it uses. So it's a efficient process. And when we get into cellular respiration, which is coming pretty quick, and photosynthesis, which is coming pretty quick, we'll have more of a detail on that. And I will show you a video as well on this that kind of goes over what is going on in active transport. So the main thing you need to sum from this video is that there's really, and we haven't even talked about osmosis, but we can add that one maybe. So osmosis, that one is just dealing with H2O. So it's the same thing as passive transport, but it's just dealing with H2O. So instead of particles coming across like O2, CO2, it's just talking about water movement. Then it has to do with large particles. So if we're trying to go, things are trying, like O2 is trying to go through here. But if you have H2O, right, it can pass through. It's not so big that it can't pass through. But the particles in here may not be able to pass through. So they don't change. The water then goes from one side to the other and changes the concentration. And that's really what happens. The particles don't move, just water. That's kind of osmosis. Again, we'll talk about these in class, look at them a little bit more in detail. Hopefully you've been finishing your egg experiment. We can discuss that in class as well. That's kind of the notes. Let me know if you have any questions. Annotate your notes and bring any questions you have about this. Make sure you've completed the reading and watched the videos. You should be fine.